So today for the light review, I am grateful to speak with David Raymond. Hello, David. Talking
Hello.
about how lighting designers need to be more aware of the health and safety risks inherent around lighting design and how we all could be better prepared. Because a lot of the work that freelancers in the lighting design consultancy world are asked to do might be part of a big project where you're part of the team and you're
Yep.
brought on to design, to bring on concepts and then develop a full design. So in that respect, it's hard to see, I mean, the big picture, as it were, because
Yep.
you're part of a team, but you're not part of the company. And
Yep.
so I always wonder whether or not the freelancers are fully protecting themselves because, in a way, depending on what level you are, you sort of expect the company to be taking care of those risks for you because you're just joining their team.
Yep.
But I wonder, is that freelancer himself or herself um, responsible if they're should it be made clear in the first instance in any text that you sign that your competencies lie in X, Y, and Z, and therefore you shouldn't stray from that. Is that fair to say, or?
Yeah, I think it's probably fair to say. I think, yeah, you are joining a team as a freelancer coming in from carrying out lighting design. You're joining part of a design team. That design process applies right across CDM. So whatever design you're involved with, if it's got any remote part of construction involved, then it comes under CDM straight away. And so if you're the principal designer, which is a duty holder under CDM, which would normally in this case come under your client responsibility, is there to coordinate and share that information with you freely. And so that design meetings that you get involved in as a freelancer would be to ensure that that information is coming to you freely. So that you can then consider that within, okay, what do I have responsibility for? And what does the client have responsibility for? And not stretching that too far, because you can only be responsible for what your work you're carrying out, and what you're responsible for, and without starting to blur those lines between your responsibility and the client's responsibility. It's very, CDM has changed several times over the last couple of decades, and predominantly the changes have moved around mainly because there has been too much responsibility put down onto contractors, and so that responsibility then is taken on. So it's the clients have much more responsibility in understanding what they want you to do. They're asking you to carry out the work, they're paying for it, so they are aware of what the risks are already, and so they should be communicating those to you, and then that should be then form part of your risk assessment.
So I guess the risk assessment is the big phrase there, isn't it? Because
Yes.
you need to do that up front, and
Yep.
It's an interesting world where I understand what you're saying about the client having to take more responsibility about setting out what it is that they require at the start, and because they're responsible for a lot of the information they give you. That said, maybe they don't understand what the processes are and what they're involved, so maybe they don't understand the depth of information that's required. So I suppose
Absolutely.
when you're a freelancer, is it your duty in a way to push for that information if the team you're working for isn't up to speed, or would that lay with the head of the company? Or
I think there's a bit of, I think responsibility probably makes it a bit too strong. I think there is a joint duty on everybody to share information and question it when you're not being provided with it. So the regulations are pretty clear in terms of information that's in the client's ownership should be shared if it's available, and that might be whether that's certain types of risks, things like asbestos or other parts that might be there already that you need to be aware of, particularly if you have to do any kind of temporary structures, or your design asks for certain types of installs. But at the same time, they're not specialists. They're not the lighting designers, so they don't necessarily know. You're right there in terms of they're asking you to be the competent person. So you're actually they're asking you to tell them in some degree. So from a risk assessment perspective, any lighting designer is going to be looking to do what we would class as a design risk assessment, which is looking at risks that are significant within the design, not starting to go deviate outside of that into standard construction risks. What PPE should I wear, that kind of thing. That's not what they're asking you to do. They're asking you to look at your design and what inherent risks lay inside that design that I can try to eliminate. So that's what CDM is all about. And so quite frequently we'll see a design risk assessment comes through that's 4 pages long, and by the time we've finished with talking with the designers and the team and trying to work through it, we've got it down to specific significant risks that are specific to that design, that we need to try to eliminate or reduce if we can.
So it sounds like the designer almost needs to be something else as well. I mean, I know that you're saying the client should be responsible for providing you with that information, but also it lies with the designer to ask the question in the first instance to
Absolutely
cover it off. Because I think there's a lot of jobs I've worked on which just have none of that up front, none of that question. So
I think it's seen too often as a bolt-on. I think it's seen as a bit of an extra. It's a sort of an afterthought sometimes. You kind of start to do it and then go, oh, hang on a minute, we've got CDM as well. That's not, more and more, and particularly with a lot of the design we work, particularly in like things like architectural design, if you follow architectural design, things like following the REBA stages, it's always about going really, really first early design. That's the point when you can make early decisions to eliminate hazards. And that's exactly what CDM and all the health and safety legislation is pushing to do. Identify something really early when it's just a simple design decision or a line on a drawing that could make a difference between somebody being exposed to a risk or not. Rather than waiting to that point when you're on site, you'd started to do the install, everybody's now exposed to it and say, oh, hang on a minute, we now need to go and buy something else because we didn't plan for that, we didn't know about that. So yes, designers should be pushing for more information because it should be available. It may not be easily available necessarily, but we should be at least asking that question and providing it in a way that's very easy to understand and easy to put into their own thoughts and say, okay, well, I didn't know about that, so I'm going to consider that in my design, and this is a way I can try to eliminate that through good design.
So ultimately, can the practice pass on CDM responsibility if they haven't overtly described it in the freelance agreement where responsibility lies? If I'm going to a company and I want to work on a project, is it if they put in their contract, you are responsible for X, Y, or Z? I guess that's down to you then, the final.
You'd always be responsible for your own design. So you're always going to be responsible for that design part of the design. If that design is impacted or if there's any part that's outside of your control, you can't be held responsible for that. That's something you can't foresee. That's why that sharing of information is critical. That's why the principal designer is so key to all of this, because they're there to coordinate the design team with and on behalf of the client. But everybody has a duty. So no matter the level of design that you're involved with, and this is a constant, maybe one could call it a battle, but it's a constant issue we always face is both client and designers understanding that it's joint responsibility. It's responsibility for everybody to identify a design issue. I'm responsible for this design, therefore it's my responsibility to try to eliminate or reduce hazards that I can face in my design. And there has been plenty of examples, and some I've been involved myself, where the HSE have gone retrospectively back through works afterwards where either an instance happened or there's been an inspection, and they found that there's been down to risks being not considered in early design. And so the liability is not just focused on the point of the install or the point of design. It goes much further beyond that. It's what you leave behind, particularly if it's a permanent install. You're leaving something behind that is continually got to be maintained and looked after. And so that is inherently much more dangerous because somebody's got to go and look after it. And if you've left something behind that is part of your design, you continue to hold that responsibility and liability for potentially many more years to come. Yeah, I mean, the ethos of CDM is that the principal designer can be a duty holder that has got sufficient skills and knowledge and experience to be able to undertake that role. So that can be a lead designer, that can be an architect, that can be a part of the design team. Something we do at Embark is we can undertake that role as part of being that duty holder, because we have that skills and knowledge and experience to be able to coordinate that role. And in addition, would also be then to kind of take a joint role as well as being principal designer, but also the advisor to the client in terms of their duties. Because as we mentioned before, the clients far too often don't know their duties, don't know their responsibilities and how to share that information, or even what information they should be sharing. So if you're advising them, saying, look, no, we missed a client, this is what we should be sharing. If you know about it, and we maybe sometimes do initial site audits, or we're sometimes now doing them remotely, and it helps them to then share more information with the design team.
Which is their obligation, right? I mean,
it's their legal obligation. Absolutely. They need to provide it. They need to provide it in a clear and concise manner, and it needs to be provided right at the beginning of the project. And that's why design team meetings need to involve always a part of CDM. It needs to be integral to what we do, not a add-on to what we do. CDM comes under the Health and Safety at Work Act. It all feeds back into that one piece of legislation that puts a responsibility on all of us. So
that's a very important point you make, and certainly from my perspective, I've seen it from both sides. So in our industry, we have almost a split between the manufacturers, the lighting designers who work within a manufacturer, and those of us who basically charge a fee for our lighting design. And even though we're under the name, I suppose, we're all lighting designers, I think those of us who have worked for manufacturers, I think maybe the water is a little bit more cloudy there, because there's less emphasis to try and find out whether you're responsible, because you've got a large company above you and you just expect them to sort it all out. But where does the responsibility lie there? Because there's almost another level of, I don't want to say bureaucracy, but another level of person above you who you almost expect to have sorted that all out before you get it, because you're almost like you're just chucking stuff out sometimes. It's like a turnover on an assembly line.
Yeah, so. I know. And it feels like that, doesn't it? You know, I mean, I was an engineer for 10 years and did design plenty of designs, and so you just design. You just need to be. It's very easy to just get into that mill of just doing more and more designs. But I think more and more there's safety has to be inherent in that design, and that comes back to a whole holistic view to trying to make sure that design has safety in mind. And it's not just the install, the construction. It's that how do we look after it? How do we maintain it? How do we keep it safe? How do I know that somebody's going to need to do that every single time? And so there's plenty of examples across lots of industries. And if we use again, some of those designs in terms of, if you look at simple things like window designs, you know, it's far too often we don't consider how often they need to be cleaned and how they're going to be cleaned. The same happens with lighting installs. How we know that they're going to need to be cleaned at some point. They definitely need to be maintained. The natural ability is just to go, oh, okay, well, we'll go and get a mobile elevator platform. That's straightforward. But you know, there's got to be more of an approach to that. That's not taking into consideration the position where it is, how, you know, we talk about Heathrow and other areas. You've got lots of other factors you have to then take into account. And so if we haven't considered those at all within our design, then, well, we're already starting from a point that's not, firstly, in the sense of following CDM, or secondly, keeping people safe. But you know, I worry in terms of, particularly on freelancers, that you're taking on liability, and And obviously, it's different to being a limited company. When you're a freelancer, it's your livelihood. It's you who are forming that liability. And if you can have all the best insurance in the world, but if you find a prosecution, you can't insure against that. It's you can insure against losses, but you can't insure against prosecution. So it forms a lot of liability, and it's a bit of a race to getting the right price. But if you're doing this design, safety has to be inherent to what we do. It doesn't necessarily need to be overcomplicated. It doesn't need to be over complex, and something we've and I personally have spent a lot of time is trying to demystify it, take away a lot of the bureaucracy from it, and that's what the HSE have worked really hard on making that the case. But there's still a thought that it's still really overly complex, and I think that's probably through just lack of understanding of how to apply it in simple terms. And exactly as you say there, the contractor being that level between the client, you, and understanding what's actually happening means that you don't get all the information you need. So then maybe the decision is, well, what's the minimum I need? What's the absolute minimum I can have to be able to create a design that I consider to be safe? And then that is a starting point. Do I have this? And if I do, then I can do that.
And also, I think the paper trail is quite important.
Absolutely.
Having asked the question in the first instance is critical. But so,
if you've proved to ask the right question, if you've proved to that, if we work this through, if you've proved that you've asked the question and still we haven't had that information come through, then you've asked the question. It doesn't remove liabilities necessarily, but if there was something to happen, you can show that you've asked the question, and you may have asked it maybe more than once, and it hasn't come forward. You can then only do with the information you've got. And that's not your liability, that's not your responsibility, that's the responsibility of either the contractor above you or the client.
So just out of interest, would that be the salesman in the case of, because I know a lot of designers do push back when they're not able to fulfill a design because of insufficient information, or because they're fearful of the consequences of what may occur should they go ahead. Would it be the salesman, or would it be the director of the company that would be up in court, so to speak?
It'd be the company director. It'd be the company that would be responsible. So they're not fulfilling their own duties under CDM for providing information clearly and concisely to all designers. So whether that then has a feedback to the client not providing that, possible. You'd have to have a full proper audit trail through, and an inspection and investigation would go through that. But the first point that any inspector is always going to do is ask to see risk assessment straight away. Have you considered all the risks? Have you been provided with all the information you need to be able to consider those risks? And if you have you then communicated them? And if you can't prove any of that, then you're already starting from a point of real concern.